Thank you, Emily, and welcome everyone. So it's my pleasure to introduce a brief introduction of Vineet. And the format for today, as Emily mentioned, is that we're going to have about Vineet speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes. If you can hold your questions till after that, that would be great. And then we'll open it up for Q&A so that we make it off of everything he goes through. The particular lenses I would like we need to look at, given his background in managing the Office of Technology Development at BU, and then going on to the other side of being in the venture capital world, where he's evaluating a number of tough tech ventures, funding them, and his own background as an entrepreneur early in his career. I think he brings a unique set of skills that are fairly appropriate for this. And his session last year was a pretty big hit, and it was very well received. So for those who will be taking my course on entrepreneurship in the life sciences, there is a section on licensing IP specific to life sciences companies, but this is a little bit broader here and a little bit more interactive, whereas we'll be doing very specific workshop-like cases in the class. So with that, I will turn it over to Vineet, and in the interest of maximizing our time with him, over to you, Vineet.
Thanks, Satish. Really appreciate it. So welcome, everyone. First, sort of a quick background on me, just to add to what Satish said. I have an engineering degree, started my first company as an engineering student back in the 70s, subsequently, 5 startups, 3 as CEO, all in this sort of aerospace and telecom space. So have always been what is now considered deep tech. And then about 15 years ago, I switched from running companies to helping other entrepreneurs, took 2 directions, teaching at Boston University, which led to running the Office of Technology Development there, and then joining a venture capital firm that had been a lead investor in my last startup. That sort of has morphed and come together in my current role as managing director at Mass Ventures, which is the state's venture capital group, founded in 1978. One of the first public venture firm in the world, one of the first 20 venture firms in the world, set up as an evergreen fund, has been operating for 45 years, and has always sort of found the gaps, where private capital wasn't, easily available. So right now our focus is deep tech, with a particular focus on academic spinouts. So it's bringing the things that I've done over the last 15 years together. I've made 9 investments in academic spinouts, all deep tech companies, also in a few nonprofit boards. So just a little bit of historical context here, for many of you who may not have this. So prior to World War II, the federal government in the US really didn't do much basic research, either in their labs or funded universities. But coming out of the war, because during the war, there had been some significant inventions such as radar that were funded by the federal government and were invented in universities, in the case of radar at MIT. There was a paper written by Vannevar Bush, who was at MIT and had seconded to the war effort. That paper, by the way, is a very interesting read if any of you are interested in science history. It's called Science, the Endless Frontier. If any of you are Star Trek fans, you remember the slogan there was, space, the endless frontier. Well, you can see where that phrase came from. So that report spawned a bunch of those 3-letter agencies we know now, called the NSF, NIH, DoD moving to DARPA, DOE. So these agencies now had federal labs and also started funding universities. In parallel, somebody else who was involved in the war effort George Dorio, along with the MIT president Carl Compton, formed the first venture capital firm in the world called AR&D, American Research Development Corporation. And that was formed in 1946, right after the war. Their storied investment in Digital Equipment Corporation in 1957 resulted in actually, I think that 500x is not right. It's a little over 300x return on their investment when digital went public in 1966. So on the venture capital side, the federal government, particularly the IRS and the SEC, fought AR&D for decades because they could not understand the business model. They thought it was a Ponzi scheme, where getting other people's money, investing it in startups just didn't feel right to them. That eventually led to some laws being changed and established in the mid-70s, which then allowed modern-day venture capital firm as we know to emerge. As Mez Ventures was founded in 1978 after those laws were passed. Now, the third thing to note is in 1980, there was something known as the Bayh-Dole Act. It just had its 50th anniversary. And that basically said that patents that emerged from research that the federal government provided to universities could be owned by the universities. And the universities then had an obligation to try to transfer this IP into commercial use. So these are important things to understand because they formed the foundation of university tech transfer as we know it now. When I took over the Boston University Tech Transfer Office, I frankly knew nothing about tech transfer. So I looked around a bit. I looked at other tech transfer offices, particularly MIT and Stanford. Also found this book by Stokes called Pastur's Quadrant, which sort of was an epiphany for me because it talked about different types of research, basic research. There was on the y-axis the fundamental quest for fundamental understanding, and in the x-axis consideration for use. So as you can see, top left, Niels Bohr sort of epitomizes basic research, where he wasn't trying to apply he was just trying to learn. If any of you have gone and seen the movie Oppenheimer, Niels Bohr features in it, and you'll see what I mean. And then on the bottom right, there's pure applied research like what Thomas Edison did. He tried out hundreds of different material combinations until he found tungsten, for the light bulb. Where we are interested are these use-inspired basic research that's happening in universities. So universities conduct the top left and the top right. They don't do applied research. But the use-inspired basic research is epitomized by Louis Pasteur, who made some fundamental contributions to microbiology, but he always was focused on real problems, right? Problems in humanity. So that top right quadrant is becoming more and more relevant in the university sphere, and that's where tech transfer needs to focus. Oops, I think I just went twice. Sorry. So the input function here is is research spending at universities, which, as you can see from the blue bar, is predominantly federal government funded. The orange bar is industry sponsored research funding at universities, and one would think that would be increasing. It really isn't. It sort of stayed flat for decades at around 3% of research funding at universities. And then the yellow bar, that's been growing, and that has two major components in it. One is university endowments. So, as you know, private research universities and even public research universities have endowments, and these endowments have been growing. Harvard's endowment is the biggest in the world. It's somewhere around 50 billion. And these endowments grow every year. But more importantly, the federal government requires 4 to 5% of the endowment to be spent every year. And that 4 to 5%, in the case of Harvard, 4% of 50 billion is around 200 million a year. That 200 million is usually used for building new facilities and for attracting new faculty and funding them. So it's becoming a bigger and bigger source of research funding for universities. The second is philanthropy. So you guys are probably familiar with the Weiss Institute at Harvard, close to $1 billion in philanthropic funding. The Broad Institute at MIT, likewise, $1 billion plus. These are translational institutions. So you're seeing more and more philanthropy coming into translating research to the marketplace. The way it's done is to a great extent through spinouts. In the past, when the Bayh-Dole Act was passed, most universities were looking to license the patents that they were filing for to existing companies. And existing companies, frankly, find a lot of these technologies too early for them. And so the way to bridge the gap is to license the patent to a startup or a spin-out, as I call it, from the university, who then goes out and raises venture capital to develop the patent into technology to a point where then it becomes interesting to industry, and you either partner with industry or they acquire you. That model has become much more prevalent, as you can see from these numbers. So that blue line are the number of startups or spin-outs coming from universities. The other is the number we'd seen before about research expenditures. So in the US, this has become a very significant economic driver. So as this slide sort of captures, these patents that then make their way into industry, either through startups or existing companies, have added close to 2 trillion to the gross industrial output of the US. So it's become a pretty significant endeavor. And I'm not putting the Massachusetts numbers up in this presentation, but Massachusetts is a significant recipient of federal research funding and subsequent translational funding, like the Small Business Innovation Research SBIR grants. And as you can see, all around Kendall Square, and hopefully soon around Alston, the fruits of that, where Kendall Square, when I arrived in Kendall Square in 1987, it wasn't a very nice place to be. I used to manufacture computers at 3rd and Binney. In fact, where that dog park is now. And we used to manufacture computers there right next to the broom factory where the blind people were, manufacturing brooms. That was Kendall Square. And now you look at Kendall Square and it's very life sciences focused and increasingly deep tech, climate tech coming with Greentown Labs. So a lot of that sort of change and growth has come from this university tech transfer and university research endeavor. So what does that entail? So, sticking to still the macro numbers in the US, you can see that the little over $1 trillion in research funding over the last couple of decades has resulted in invention disclosures. This is the first step, that if there's a faculty member doing research, they think what they have is novel, they can file what's known as an invention disclosure. Every university has it. That comes to the tech transfer office, who then evaluates it from many different ways and decides to file a patent. So you can see that you go from about half the invention disclosures turns into patent filed. There are many reasons why the other half are not filed. It could be that it wasn't that novel. Could be they don't have the budget. It could be that the faculty member lost interest. And then about half the patents that are filed are actually issued by the US Patent Office. And again, that attrition could be for many reasons. It could be that they denied it because they didn't feel it was novel. There was some, prior art, as it's called, so prior patents. It could be that the university abandons it because they don't see the commercial value of it. Anyway, so those 100,000 plus issued patents over the last 20 years have resulted in about 50,000 active licenses and about 7,000 active spinouts. And the sort of end result of this, after a lot of investment goes into developing these patents, is royalties from sales. And that cumulative royalties is somewhere around 50 billion from this endeavor over the last 20 years. So it's big, but for these universities, these royalties are not that significant, right? I mean, Boston University is a $2.2 billion a year endeavor. And, I was able to increase the royalties considerably, but it was in the tens of millions, and it really doesn't have an impact. Harvard's royalties are also in the tens of millions. Doesn't really have a major impact. So it's not royalties that's driving, the universities and tech transfer offices to license these patents. The other thing to note is that of these active licenses, less than 0.5% are generating more than $1 million annually in royalties. So it's a game of hits. So there are very few hits that drive the majority of royalties. And so it becomes extremely difficult for a tech transfer office to pick winners. You just don't know what's going to be a hit. So the offices have to operate in this, very uncertain environment. And generally, their response to that uncertain environment is driven mainly by the size of their patent budget. If you have a big patent budget, you basically patent every invention disclosure, or you try to. And then you wait for the industry or venture capitalists to find those, interesting patents to license them out. Most universities don't have an unlimited patent budgets. They have to make, they have to triage and make decisions on what to fund. And it becomes very hard to do because the stuff is so early, you just don't know what's going to be a hit. And, to give you an example, there's a recent study done on Stanford, 50 years of sort of, tech transfer at Stanford. And you can see that, if anything, the hits are becoming smaller and smaller. And this is actually happening all over the country at most universities. It's getting harder and harder to find those hits. But that doesn't mean that the tech transfer endeavor is not important. It just means that one has to come up with a way to increase the volume of your patents and licenses and hope that some of them become hits. There's another view to look at Stanford in what was being patented and what sort of became hits. And again, if you just look at the amount of research investment going into these and sort of the royalties that are coming out, they're declining. You can also see what has changed over the years or what universities are working on. We've moved from physics to chemistry to biology, right? In what universities are spending basic research funding on. So what's the process? So if you're a PI, as it's called, a principal investigator, the important thing is to identify a big problem. Incremental problems just don't cut it in university tech transfer. You have to go after big problems. And if you have it, you file an invention disclosure, you go and publish, because that's what, faculty do. And also importantly, you go do a proof of concept just to prove that your solution, your science can be translated to engineering. And usually you can do that with funds from the university or with federal government funds. And so once you've done that and you feel like, okay, we've got something that might be commercially viable, you have two options. You can either find an existing company to license it out or do a new venture. As I said, new ventures are becoming more common. If it's a new venture, really there's two pieces: people and money. When I got to BU, I didn't know anything about tech transfer, as I said. So, being coming out of the computer industry, the first thing I did was I created a data flow diagram of what the Office of Technology Development does. The reason I'm presenting this is just to give you an idea of how complex the job is for these tech transfer offices. So the thickness of the line is how much time and communication you spend. So obviously, faculty, where your customer is the thickest line. You're communicating with faculty all the time. The next thickest line is your business outreach, right? Because you're trying to license this stuff out to either startups or existing companies. And then the third big line is service providers, which is predominantly law firms, because you outsource the patent prosecution. You don't usually do it in-house. And then the last is the sort of overhead to the university administration, which keeps growing, like research compliance, conflict of interest, those kind of things. You can also see from this diagram that the job of tech transfer is really a data management problem, because you can reduce everything to data. And because it's a data management problem, one can do a better job of automating it. And especially with the newer tools that are coming out, you're starting to see more and more offices experimenting with, tools, including AI tools, to do the matching process. So now getting down to the meat of what a tech transfer office does. One, you have to understand that the ownership of these patents, if it's federally funded, the university retains ownership, but has to provide margin rights for national security. So if the federal government decides that it needs a license to a patent the university has that was federally funded, it is allowed to go in and march in. It rarely does that. If there's no federal funding, if it was funded by industry or funded by the university itself, then those patents can be assigned to inventors. In the previous case, you cannot assign the patents, you have to license the patents. So the ownership always stays with the university. It never goes to the startup or the company. Every university has a patent policy. You can read the one at Harvard. You can. I'll show you a reference of one we have at BU. And basically, with a patent policy, it has two big things. One is it's an invention assignment to the university, unlike a company. If you're working on a company, usually sign an invention assignment agreement. This is the same. So if you're paid by the university in any way, faculty, grad students, postdocs, you are going to assign your inventions to the university. If you're an undergrad and you're not getting paid, you can keep your inventions. Most universities will not try to retain ownership in undergrad research. Okay, that's an important thing to know. And then the second piece of the patent policy is how royalties are divvied up. And roughly it's a third, a third, a third. A third goes to the inventors, a third goes usually to the department they were in, and a third goes to the university. The other components of the license are field of use. So you could have an exclusive worldwide for all fields of use, which is usually fairly common, versus having non-exclusive licenses, which, for example, the Broad Institute likes to really focus, they don't like going to exclusive licenses. Their thinking is that a lot of people should get access to this IP so it can get broad use commercially. And it could be anything in between, right? So could be geographical field of use. It could be application field of use, right? So these are all sort of things you negotiate with the tech transfer office. Now on the dollar side of the license, there are 4 components to it. One is patent costs. So the university, first and foremost, is going to recover its sunk patent costs. So, the patents that the expenses relate to patenting while it was the university. And of course, any ongoing patent expenditures. So remember, they own the patent. So the prosecution of the patent they own will be done through the university. So the university will hire the lawyer will bill the university, and then that invoice is passed through to the licensee. Second are milestone payments, and these are usually time or specific technology milestones. And milestones could be funding milestones. It could be a filing at the FDA milestone. So those kind of things. The third is equity. Universities will typically take 5 to 10% of founding equity in a spin-out. Used to be 5%. They're trying to push for a higher, but you negotiate down to somewhere around 5-6%. And then the fourth component are royalties on product sales, and these of course vary according to the technology. If it's something that's going to take a lot of investment and a long time to bring to market, like a new drug, the royalties are quite low. They're like in the 1% range. If it's digital health, that's not going to take a lot of investment. The royalties could be high, could be 10% or 12%, right? And everything sort of in between. And so another way to think about this is that university is trying to get like 3 bites at the apple. The first is near term, which is the patent costs. Both are sunk patent costs, and these can get pretty large. Typically they're in the $40,000-$50,000 range, but I just recently saw, we were looking at a spin out from Northeastern University, and it had a fairly large patent portfolio associated with it, with over a dozen patents, and they had sunk $300,000+ into it. So the first thing they're going to do is try to get that back from you, which is hard as a startup, because when you're spinning out in the beginning, you don't have any funding. It takes you 6, 8, 12 months to go raise money. So how do you come up with this money, right? So that becomes a negotiation point. Many universities will push out the sunk patent costs. At least that's what I used to do at BU. We push it out by a year just to give the spin out time to go raise money. The medium-term bite at the apple are these milestone payments, right? So these sort of bring in money over a period of 1 to 5-6 years from when the license is written. This is before the technology gets into the market and starts generating sales. And then the long term really has 2 bites of the apples: the royalties and the equity. And you ask the question, why both? Well, in many cases, that initial patent that got the spin out off the ground, once they get going, they file additional patents. They might feel like they don't even need that initial patent, right? And this is not infrequent, it happens. And if that's the case, then the university is out of luck for long term, because there won't be any royalties, because you're going to give that patent back. But they will still own some equity in the company, right? So they're getting rewarded for that first, spin out, right in the beginning. I have some, other things one can read. There are a couple of papers that I published. One that you might find very interesting, if you Google Bush Center University Innovation Impact, you'll find this report. It's a study of 200 research universities and medical centers, and who's doing well and who's not doing well. We applied 14-15 variables. and came up with some very interesting statistical information. The other is kind of my experience at Boston University in turning around that tech transfer office. The motto I used there was maximize collisions and minimize friction. And you know, you can look that up on ResearchGate. There's also the Stanford study that you can pick up on Science Direct. And lastly, there's a survey done in the UK, which actually is more global, about licensing and license terms for different startups. We're about to do a similar survey here of Massachusetts Spinouts, you know, to really go find out what their experience has been with the tech transfer offices and with, you know, what kind of terms that they've got to shed sort of more light, because it's a very opaque world when you negotiate a license from a tech transfer office. And our goal here at Mass Ventures is to shine a light on it to make it more transparent, you know, for the spinouts. So that culminates the broadcast part of the lecture here. Open for Q&A now. Let's see.
Okay, we have a question here from Ron.
Go ahead, Gibran. You're on mute, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Hi, and thank you for that. That was very insightful. You mentioned that undergrads, generally, because they're not getting paid, right, they tend to keep the IP that if they generate any. Is that true for grad students as well, especially because a lot of their funding comes, for example, from the NIH? So the university is not actually directly paying them. So do they keep their IPs as well? So that's question one.
No, they don't.
Okay, so that's also basically owned by the university, because I guess the NIH funding is coming through the university. Is that why?
Exactly.
Okay. And then question number 2 is around some of these newer models of, I guess, the spinouts, right? Like Nucleate Bio.
Yeah.
You know, with organizations like these, how does that pie get split up further? Or, you know, I mean, how does that kind of change the landscape that currently exists with these license transfers?
It doesn't at all. So, you know, accelerators like Nucleate, like Activate, like, you know, the engines, Blueprint, none of those entities take any equity or any piece of the project. They're basically educational activities. In the end, the asset is being licensed from the university. So if anything, what the accelerators do is better prepare you for doing the spin out and for doing the negotiation, you know, with the tech transfer office. But other than that, they don't have any impact on the terms of the licenses. Maybe while people are pondering this, quick raise of hands. Not everybody's on video here, but how many of you have or are thinking about doing a spin out? So I only got one hand raised. So Paul, where are you going to do a spin out based on any IP from university?
Yes, I've been looking at a couple different things. My brother is a vascular surgeon at SUNY in Syracuse, and so we've been talking about some of the work there, and him and I have developed some IP that we've filed patents for. But I'm also been looking a lot in the Boston area as well, and so I wanted to ask you, I know you talk about a lot about the details as to, you know, things to account when you go through these deals and the way the process works. But if we were to take that step back, what are the best ways, you know, to somebody in the Boston area to see what's going on, you know, in some of these fields without having, I guess, relatively an in? Ironically, my cousin just finished his PhD at the Broad, working in the lab with Fang for CRISPR. But, you know, I've seen everything kind of more just like random, you know, connections have made these lines. But from somebody from the outside, if you want to learn what research is going on, what IP has been developed and what needs, has potential to be spun out? Where do you start and what circles do you go into?
Yeah, so let me, I'll answer the question in a second. On the thing you're doing with your uncle, I think it was your uncle, with Syracuse, the IP that you've developed, it sounds like it was developed outside of the university. So one thing I would encourage you to do if you're thinking about, trying to commercialize that, is make sure you go to the tech transfer office at SUNY in Syracuse and get a letter from them saying that they're fine, that they don't think they have any access to this IP. So this happens often. You don't want to go further down, and then later they come after you, which has happened, right? The universities will come after startups. To answer your second question, it's tough. So, in Massachusetts, we're getting close to 7.5, 8 billion in research funding coming to 34 research institutions, okay? And that's resulting in, somewhere around 130 spinouts a year. So there is no rifle shot way of, figuring this out. Looking at databases of patents, which, exist, is just a waste of time because, the patent's only as good as the inventors. So in the end, you want to meet the inventors. So let me flip it. So we're in the business of investing in these academic spinouts. So I'm basically in the business of doing what you just asked, Paul. How do I identify those interesting things? How do I identify them early enough to invest in them? So my life has become a lot, one, because I've been doing this for 15 years, I have a pretty good idea now. There are about 200 prolific PIs across Massachusetts. Right? These are the ones who are in Pastur's Quadrant, who have grad students and postdocs that are interested in commercializing. So I know who those people are. But more importantly, where I'm getting a lot of my deal flow now is from Nucleate and Activate and Blueprint, and the engine, because these places have sort of become qualifiers for those technologies. So what I would do if I were you is hang out in those places.
Thank you.
Cecilia?
Hi, thanks so much for the time and chatting with us. I think just one quick question, do you have a recommended standard checklist of terms we should aim for in doing tech transfer? I think from the presentation I saw 5% equity, the sunk patent costs, the 2 to 6% royalty rates. Are there any other things you would say aim for this in negotiations?
I don't have anything like that written down, but part of the goal of doing this survey is coming to that. So just so you know, the terms of most of these licenses, in my 15 years of experience of doing this, and I've seen hundreds of these, is the terms end up being plus or minus 10%. So that's not the difficult part. The difficult part is the process. The process is so opaque and can take so long. And frankly, a lot of entrepreneurs obviously don't have any experience, so they go out and hire a law firm, which is a mistake. When I was at BU, I used to tell these entrepreneurs, do not hire a law firm. You do not need a law firm to negotiate this agreement because 90% of this agreement is non-negotiable, right? The university is not going to budge on a bunch of the legal language that's in there. And it can get a little daunting because you look at all this language, you wonder, what the hell does this mean? So, in Satish's class, for example, we unpack that, the license. And, part of my goal is to sort of create an annotated license that answers a lot of these questions. So you can see what's important to go negotiate and what's not important. I don't have that reference to give to you right now, but we're preparing it.
I think, Cecilia, I think as Vinit mentioned, we covered those terms of the license in our class, and also, kind of go through the dissection and give you a sample license and terms, etc. So that's covered in in the entrepreneurship in the life sciences class in the fall.
Thank you.
Yeah, Kelly, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to find the raise my hand button. I joined slightly late, so sorry if this is something that was covered originally, but just in the context of today's market with, technology moving ultra quickly, do you have any tips on, and so like basically innovations and technologies that we want to patent today could become obsolete in, a year or quicker than before. Do you have any tips on like recommending how entrepreneurs approach this?
So I would both agree and disagree with you. I would agree with you that many areas of innovation are moving quickly. Ray Kurzweil, 20 years ago, wrote a paper that says technology innovation is exponential. But there are, especially kind of in our fields, in the deep tech fields, innovation is not happening that quickly, right? It takes 15 years to bring a new drug to market. That period of time has not come down. If anything, it's got longer. In advanced materials, now, there's no doubt that there are certain markets where you can attract a lot more research funding because they're especially private funding. Example right now is lithium-ion batteries, for example, right? There's such a huge demand for lithium-ion batteries and innovation lithium-ion that pretty much anybody who's got something new or decent will get funded. I've funded one of them out of Harvard. We just funded another one out of Stanford that moved here. So we've got a bit of a battery, cluster forming in Boston. Now, most recently, climate tech, right? Huge focus on climate tech, a lot of new funds. So if you can get sufficient funding, you can move things faster. But in the end, these deep tech things just take a long time to engineer. And so those patents are still very valid, and you're writing new patents as you go along. Now, that also brings out the value of know-how, right? So know-how is very critical. So that's something that is hard to replicate, right? So even in a fast-moving space, know-how, if you, and that's part of intellectual property. It's not something universities will license, but it's knowledge that you have. You can protect that, and you should be smart at protecting it because that becomes your differentiator, right, as you go. So the patents may become less valuable, but your know-how becomes more valuable over time. Does that answer your question?
Yep, it does. Thank you.
Vineet, it may be useful for, as you look across the terms of the standard term sheets that universities produce. I think there are certain areas which are negotiable, right? Like, royalty rates and things like that. And there are certain areas non-negotiable, like things around, rights, especially, and restrictions that they don't. I think it may be useful for folks here to hear about, like, when you sit across, I want two perspectives, right? One, when you sit across licensing out of a university, what is negotiable, not negotiable? And when you put on your VC hat, how do you think about these terms, when you're looking to make an investment and somebody's already negotiated a term sheet, right? They've already had a license agreement. Do you ask them to go back and renegotiate, or, things? How do you look at it? I think that's an interesting topic.
So
those two topics.
So the first thing we look at is actually not part of the license, which is what does a cap table look like? So if the founding cap table has too much equity given to the faculty members, that's a big red flag for us. because the faculty members are not going to be the ones who are going to leave their jobs at the universities to focus on the startup, right? And so as a result, they should not be the biggest equity owners. The biggest equity owners should be the management team, right? That's actually doing the startup. So many tech transfer offices don't guide these spinouts from that regard. And that's why as an investor, that's one of the first things I look at. As far as the license goes itself, the first thing we would look at on the license is the fields of use. So the narrower the fields of use, the less interesting it gets for us, right? Now, fortunately, most of these licenses are worldwide exclusive field of use, right? The actual terms of royalties, the amount of equity the university owns, the milestone payments, you know, as I said, they end up being plus or minus 10%. At least in Massachusetts, most universities are pretty adept at this, and they won't over negotiate those numbers. So it's rare that we see things, you know, out of the norm in those kind of, you know, from that perspective. As far as, you know, the restrictions, you know, the first time I saw one of these university licenses when I was at BU, you know, I told the general counsel, I said, you got to be kidding. We won't represent, I understand that we won't represent that this IP is valuable or not, right? That's fine because it's all subjective. But we won't even represent that we own the IP. And I said, how can we do that? And that's why a lot of companies like push back and say, like, what is this? How can you not represent it? You own the IP? The reason a lot of those clauses are in there is because universities are a big target for lawsuits and have been burned in the past. And so these things have all made their way into the license for that reason. I would tell entrepreneurs, like, don't worry about that stuff. You know, there's no point trying to negotiate all that rights language. It's going to cost you a lot of time and money for no reason. The other thing the advice I would give is manage the process. So, you know, right up front, sit down with the tech transfer office and force them to lay out a process and a timeline. They're going to resist like mad, but, you know, one should force them to at least lay out what the process is and rough order timelines. Because these things can take forever. I mean, I just got off a call with a grantee, you know, that they were funded by the Engine. They're in the Engine, big climate tech company. 15 months to negotiate a license with MIT, right? And this is very typical now. I mean, all these universities have got very difficult, and it's managing the process. And it's not that they're on their side, you know, trying to be difficult. It's just that they're overworked, and it's a complex place. You know, you saw from my data flow diagram, but it's incumbent on you to manage the process, right?
Thanks, Vineet. I mean, we'll take some more questions. We have 5 more minutes. Any additional questions?
I have a question that's a little bit of I guess side question. I mean, I think that I've been in touch with this company called Vaxess. You guys have definitely heard about it. And they, you know, I was chatting with the CEO, HBS alum, 2015, and he was sharing his story with me about how his team basically licensed the technology from Tufts, right? I think that what was interesting as I was thinking about it and reflecting on the conversation was how many regulatory loopholes, and not loopholes necessarily, but like regulatory processes you have to go through before you can, you know, really kind of achieve some kind of, I guess, like feasibility for your business. And it's all very risky. And then on the flip side, there's these models which business models which will create consumer goods, but they will use scientific data for them. So, one example would be this company that we read about called DO Health Sciences, in which they use information, from published data on allergens and like what the, I guess, recommendations might be. So it's still based in scientific literature, but they generate a consumer goods product that sort of bypasses the regulatory, I guess, requirements. So they're still kind of using the information that is being generated in these labs, but they're kind of not having to pay any fees or of any kind. So I'm kind of wondering, like, what your thoughts on that are. Obviously, it's the right thing to do is to, pay licensing fees, I think, for innovation that happens in universities, because you want for that to be a sustainable process.
Yeah.
But that then at the same time, for, I guess, like the impact, right, you can still kind of make that translational impact without really having to worry about these licensing fees and so on.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So first of all, the Vax's technology came from probably the most prolific inventor at Tufts. It's Kaplan. It's his sort of silk portfolio. It's funny because we're looking at another one that came out of Tufts that's now next generation, also, patch delivery. Great company. They're doing very well. So the universities are struggling with this concept of data. So remember I told you they don't license know-how. And data, in a way, falls into the know-how category. It's sort of in between, know-how and patents. So you don't patent data, but data is becoming more and more valuable. Universities are sitting on large databases. And one of the biggest databases in the world is the Framingham Heart Study, right? That's managed by Boston University, funded by NIH. It's, 3 generations of the city of Framingham, all their phenotypical, genotypical genome data from these people. It's a massive database, but I tried to figure out how to monetize it and ran into all kinds of roadblocks. So call it a loophole, but for now, you can get access to data from universities without a license.
All right, Emily, over to you. Yeah, sorry, somebody asked.
Hi, thanks a lot for joining. Would you allow one question that's more of a monetization question than an actual licensing question, unless there is any more licensing questions? Thank you. So I'm working in biotech, and we're preparing a drug that, based on preclinical data, enables PD-L1 to work in cancer types where it did not work before. The problem that I see is that our drug basically combines an existing generic with an existing natural compound. So basically, the drug on its own, I don't see that we could monetize it too much. However, if it does work to basically enable PD-L1, then it would allow and enable like a lot more higher new market for PD-L1. So basically, where I'm looking for some guidance is that, are there examples? Is it kind of like a practice in biotech to basically go to these pharma companies and let's say that we could open up like 10,000 new patients based on PD-L1's price, that's a certain amount of number in hundreds of millions, and then to take a certain cut of that new market from them as a sort of commission / value-based pricing for our drug, assuming that they would give our drug for $1, given that you can't really monetize the drug itself. So the question is, do you think that that's a feasible business model, this kind of like value-based value for it?
So there's a few ways you can do it, and I don't exactly understand the way you're doing it, but you can repurpose an existing drug, for a different disease. If you do that, you can actually file a new patent on it. You can take an existing drug and come up with a new delivery mechanism, right? That's patentable. You can take an existing drug and then formulate it with another drug, so that these combination therapies, right? you can formulate them together, that's patentable. So, but, you know, those are the avenues where you can monetize sort of an existing drug. And it's not clear to me what yours is, but those avenues are well understood. You can do the research, you can see how it's done.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Vineet, for sharing your expertise with us today. Thanks, Satish, for joining us as well. And to both of you for taking the time, and to everyone else for joining this session. So have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.